Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Union as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here to the west of Avdiivka, where the Russians have made several advances. In the direction of Semenivka, the Russians have reached the outskirts of the northern parts of the village with only one fortification contested. Other than that, the Russians will have a connection between Semenivka and Berdishi under their control. In the direction of Berdishi, the Ukrainians have been pushed out of the village again, as the Russians have launched offensive operations in the western parts. They do not have full control of the western parts, but fighting is taking place there as the Ukrainians attempt to hold on to their positions and the Russians attempting to push them out. This comes as following to the Russian capture of Bakhmut and completely cutting off the supply road to the north. With this, the Ukrainians do not have any on-road supply routes to and from Berdishi, which makes holding it and resupplying it very, very difficult for the Ukrainian armed forces. Instead, it is likely that the Russians will continuously push the Ukrainians out until they are forced to withdraw through these off-road supply lines, which will be very difficult for them due to the weather conditions. At the same time, the Russian artillery will have a clear shot of all of the Ukrainian infantry moving through that area, as they would have drones flying overhead all the time, allowing them to pinpoint Ukrainian locations and direct artillery towards them. This will be a very costly withdrawal for the Ukrainians, as the Russians have completely cut off all supply routes. The capture of Semenivka and Berdishi is very important for the Russians in this section of the front line, as it will allow the Russians to start moving towards the second line of defense of the Ukrainians, towards Novoselivka Persha in the western direction, in the southern direction towards Umanske, bypassing the fortifications by hitting them from the side, combining that with an assault in the southern direction towards the southern parts of Umanske, and in a northwestern direction, connecting with the parts by Ocheretine to fight by Solovyove and continuing thereof. So we're seeing that the capture of Berdishi and Semenivka would be instrumental to the Russian fighting here to the west of Avdiivka. However, there are these final parts they need to capture to attempt that. In the direction of Ocheretine, the Russians have advanced further, both in the eastern, northern, and western directions. The Russians are currently attacking in all directions to push the Ukrainians out of the village, following heavy bombing campaigns with FAB bombs and artillery shells, as well as armored assaults, launching attacks towards these eastern parts and northwestern parts of the village to completely push the Ukrainians out, making them even more vulnerable to Russian artillery and air force. The Ukrainians are having a very difficult time dealing with this Russian advance, as the Russians are simply outnumbering and heavily bombarding their positions, and the Ukrainians have yet to receive additional artillery. The artillery they do have available have likely gone out of rationing, as they expect more to arrive soon, so they're using more. On top of that, the Ukrainians have developed new strategies with the equipment that they have available. Currently, we're seeing that the strategy of the Russians and the Ukrainians is to launch a drone. This drone flies over to position of the enemy side. This forces the other side's infantry to hide within trenches, fortifications, somewhere underground, which makes it difficult for the drone to actually hit those soldiers. Now the idea is to follow up with a land-based drone that drives up to the position either by going inside of it or on top of it and then blows the whole thing up. This makes it very difficult for either side to hide from FPV drones, because while the Ukrainians make use of this strategy, the Russians simply launch heavier explosives, artillery strikes, FAB bombs. All of this allows the Russians to inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are attempting to even the playing field with what they have available. However, comparing land-based drones and FAB bombs is very difficult. So with this, we see that there's heavy pressure by the Russians here towards the northwestern parts of Avdiivka as they continuously launch assaults. According to Deep State Map, the Russians have also captured this first line here, the east of Novoselivka, and this one to the northeast. However, I am hesitant to use Deep State Map as a source ever since that Syrsky took control as the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, because since then Deep State Map has been in close coordination with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, and ever since then they have been much less reliable. However, considering this is reportedly Russian advances, it is more believable that they would tell the truth, because what change I've noticed since they started working closely with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is that they delay reporting on Russian advances. This is likely in relation to trying to prevent the Ukrainian troops that follow the website, because there are a lot of Ukrainian troops even at the front line, as well as the Ukrainian population, following Deep State Map closely. And due to that, if they constantly see Russian advances in areas of the front, they start getting a hit towards their morale. So now it is more controlled, it is more delayed, it is more simplified, it is more hold back what the Russians actually do. For example, in the direction of Semenivka, we have seen Russian presence within Semenivka for 3 weeks now, and it is first reported by Deep State Map today that they actually control some territory. So this is a significant delay to the Russians advancing with that section of the front line. So if they report that the Russians have captured this, it is likely true, but I'm waiting for further confirmation from sources that I consider reliable. The current state of the frontier northwest of Avdiivka is that the Russians are pressuring in all of these directions: to the north by Novokalinove and Keremik, northwest towards Osheretine and Novobakhmutivka, towards Sokil and Shiavove. Then we're here in the direction of the northwest of Avdiivka towards Berdishi and Semenivka. When the Russians capture these frontline villages that are currently being fought over, it is likely that the Russians will look to capture Umanske, Yasnobodivka, and Nitelove here in the southwest or western parts of Avdiivka, before moving on through Semenivka towards Novoslivka, Persha, Novopokrovske, and in the direction of the villages along the road by Novobakhmutivka, and further alongside the rail lines. In the northern direction, it is likely that they will look to gain control over the roads and fortifications in the northern flank of Osheretine, to expand from the village itself, as it has positions located in the high ground, towards these positions around the village itself. Further north in the direction of Bakhmut, we see that a Ukrainian counterattack has managed to recapture some forest lines to the north of Klishchiivka, south of Ivanivske. This really makes no sense at all, as it is a Ukrainian attempt, I believe, to outflank the Russian advances here in the section of the front line towards the north of Klishchiivka and in Ivanivske. However, this does not make much sense, because the Russians now have an open road from Ivanivske further south to cut off such an advance, and they can combine that with Russian assaults towards the fortifications of the Ukrainians northwest of Klishchiivka to completely encircle them. The Russians are the ones with the strong flanks in this section of the front line. The Ukrainians may look to launch a counterattack, but this is a poor position to do so from, as if the Russians were to be pushed back and the Ukrainians capture this section right here, and they combine that with an assault from Klishchiivka, it's very difficult for them to actually gain control over the forested areas, and the Russians could use that to counterattack and recapture positions in the Ukrainian flanks. The Ukrainians would need to gain control over the fortifications here to the west of Klishchiivka if they want to successfully launch any sort of counterattack in this section of the front line. Recapturing these fortifications would allow the Ukrainians to push the Russians out of the forested areas and then launch some operations here in the north as well, hitting the Russian southern flank of Ivanivske and opening it up for counterattacks by the Ukrainians in this section of the front line to recapture fortifications south of Ivanivske and push through the village. However, in my opinion, it is clear that the Russians have already moved past Ivanivske. The fighting is now over Chasiv Yar and the flanks of Chasiv Yar, and any Ukrainian positions here on the eastern bank of the canal is not really that well planned out. The Ukrainians should not be thinking about how to conduct the next counterattack, but instead on how to secure the defensive lines. And one best way to do that right now is to secure a front line by the canal line and secure the Russians from breaking through that canal. As the Russians have yet to gain any foothold across, this means that the Ukrainians have a prime position right now here in the western front of Bakhmut, eastern front of Chasiv Yar, to secure the canal and prevent Russian breakthrough. But instead they are launching countertanks across, which is completely senseless. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.